Back for part three of our series on transgender history. So part three, we had just wrapped up talking about sort of the late 1800s on into the turn of the century and all the way up until the 1930s when there was the first documented case of a patient undergoing male to female genital transition surgery. And that person was Dora Richter. So now we're going to talk about what's going on in the 1940s. A couple of things to note. The Langley Porter Psychiatric Clinic at the University of California at San Francisco was founded in the 1940s, and throughout the 40s and 50s, they compiled a tremendous amount of research on sexual variance. For that and many, many other reasons, San Francisco has long been sort of a hub of LGBTQAI communities, dating back even earlier than the 40s and 50s. But this certainly played part of that. Other different research centers and access to different surgical and medical treatment in San Francisco for trans folks. Another thing going on in the 1940s is in 1942, Louise Lawrence started a communication network. Louise was a trans woman who sort of scoured personal ads and magazines and newspapers to try to find other like-minded people and would publish letters and send articles and letters to friends through this correspondence network to kind of imagine a time before there was the internet, um, and there was not really an easy way to communicate with other people who had experiences like you. I mean, imagine without having the internet, finding someone who has sort of the same niche interest or desires that you have. It's very easy to do now, but at the time it required a very skillful eye to read through publications and try to find people all over the world or all over the country even that shared your views. So that was something Louise Lawrence was working on in 42. Virginia Prince did something very similar in the 50s. I'll talk about that later. And Virginia Prince was actually jailed for the same act. So this was very dangerous work at the time, publishing information and talking about information on trans experiences. One change that happened is in 1949, California law made it illegal for a surgeon to destroy healthy tissue. So this effectively banned transgender surgery because most trans people do not have unhealthy tissue. They have a desire to no longer have that tissue as part of their true identity. So with that law then on the books, most of the surgeries done in the 50s were done so in secrecy. So the one in the 30s was done not necessarily publicly, but it wasn't as controversial as it would later become. So again, a lot of what happens in the culture outside of sex and sexuality has a deep impact on how people feel about sex and sexuality. And that definitely changes the access that folks have to affirming treatments. So at a time in early history where no one was really publicly talking about this and most people didn't know a trans person, it was pretty easy to fly under the radar. There was a small network of doctors who would work with you, and if you had money and you were a man, so you had privilege, a white man specifically, you were able to live in the city and access surgery, and no one really knew. So by the late 1940s and early 1950s, there was a lot going on in the country around World War II, and some of the post-war backlash to sort of loosened up gender roles. You'll remember that women were working in factories at the time and then were suddenly asked to go back home. Get out of the factory, stop working, to make room for the GIs coming back to go to work. So that sort of anxiety around gender ebbs and flows throughout history. So it's not a constant, and that's one of the ways that we know that there's nothing really biological or natural about our anxiety about gender. That exists because of the culture and the historical experience we've had. In 1952, then, as a result again of some of this backlash, there began to be obscenity laws created and on the books. Now, you'll remember if you read through some of the articles on reproductive rights history, and you should have, that one of the reasons that reproductive rights and birth control advocates got into so much trouble was because they were sending pamphlets through the mail. And the United States wrote up obscenity laws preventing anything considered to be obscene from being sent through the US mail. So this becomes very important in a minute here. In 1952, Virginia Prince, another trans woman, published Transvestia, a journal for the American Society for Equality in Dress. Um, there's an image again in the slideshow of a cover of Transvestia. This was a publication explicitly targeting heterosexual men who wanted to wear women's clothing and explicitly excluded gay men. This was not a publication for gay men, it was for straight men who wanted to dress as women. They also focused in this publication pretty heavily on second wave feminist issues of dress reform, allowing women to wear pants. So they kind of tied together that sort of burgeoning second wave of feminist desire on the part of women to access male clothing for comfort and for accessibility and mobility, and talked at the same time about how nobody should feel restricted by their gender, their appropriate gendered clothing. So kind of capitalizing again on the relationship between feminism and this trans activism, which just like feminism and the abolition movement was a unsteady history. There are some areas where they meshed very well together, and then other areas where they have caused each other a great deal of harm. Mostly feminists causing trans individuals harm throughout history. Something you might have heard on the internet is a TERF, T-E-R-F, a trans erasing radical feminist. So the radical feminists, as you'll remember, were largely part of the second wave movement and 1960s and 70s. And a big part of their rhetoric was only women can be feminists, only natural born women can understand what it's like to be a woman, and that men who dress as women are trying to infiltrate women's private spaces for perverse reasons, right? And that has created a lot of hurt between feminism and trans activism. And then on the flip side of that, a lot of lesbian communities and feminist communities have been pretty harsh, to put it mildly, towards trans men. So born women who transition to men, saying that, they don't want to be women because being a woman sucks. And there's a lot of relative oppression of women. So the argument was that if you just dress as a man, you won't have to deal with the oppression of women anymore. And of course, that's wrong in about 1,000 ways, because trans people are not out here enjoying a privileged existence. But that was another one of the trans erasing radical feminist viewpoints, was that all of these lesbians are going to become trans men so that they can enjoy the privilege of being men. So if you've heard that terminology, TERF, TERF, that's what that means. And you can start to see some of that happening here, where again, it's an uneasy marriage between feminism and trans activism. So going back to Virginia Prince, in 52 she published this journal and a couple of issues of this journal. But by 1959, these publications and the correspondence networks like Louise Lawrence's became criminalized as a result of these new laws. What was defined as obscene at the time was largely subjective. It could be anything that disrupted the expected or accepted cultural narratives about gender, about race, about anything. The idea was to prevent, I guess, pornographic material from being mailed, but that's not really how it played out. It ended up being a lot more information about things like birth control. This all came about largely as a result of the Red Scare, again at the end of World War II and at the start of the Cold War. The United States was in a state of perpetual anxiety about the hydrogen bomb dropping at any given time, because the world was at war, and there was a lot of fear of communism and the fear that communists were infiltrating America. And they used that fear, the government used that fear to allow citizens to give up some pretty significant rights, like things like sending things through the mail. And they were then surveillance or surveying the mail and surveying citizens to see if anyone was a secret communist. And anyone could be accused of communism for any reason. So the Red Scare allowed the government to get away with pretty intense surveillance of citizens. And if you pay attention, that tends to happen anytime there's a great deal of anxiety. And that's super relevant right now. As we are undergoing a pretty terrifying time in the United States where we're all under lockdown with this pandemic, the government is in a position to make some pretty sweeping laws about where we're allowed to go and what we're allowed to do and what we're allowed to say, that kind of defy the American ethos of individualism. And people are comfortable giving up those rights and privileges in an effort to feel more safe and secure. And that also happened after 9/11 in 2001, when there was a terrorist attack on American soil. The government pushed through the Patriot Act, which at that time intensified national security, created the Department of Homeland Security, created ICE, Immigration and Customs, and allowed pretty intensive surveillance of U.S. citizens by the government. And the Patriot Act was renewed many, many times after 9/11 because people were willing, again, to trade in privacy for safety. And we see that happening now again during this pandemic. So the exact same thing was happening in the late 1950s with this Red Scare. And Prince, unfortunately, Virginia Prince, the publisher of Transvestia, was eventually tried and jailed for a decent amount of time for violating obscenity laws by sharing information about transvestites. That was a pretty significant moment in transgender history, where prior to that, they weren't getting too much attention, and now all of a sudden a lot of transvestite behaviors were becoming criminal. And I just want to make a quick language note here. Transvestite is no longer a word that's being used, nor is transsexual in the LGBT community. I'm using those outdated words now to describe how they were used historically so you can understand the building of these experiences throughout history. But I want to be very clear that these are not words that you should use to describe people today. These were historical terms and they belong in history. We have better words now to describe these experiences, and those were discussed in all of our vocabulary discussion last week. So do remember that, and I'm using them now as a rare occasion as I'm discussing the history. Okay, I'm going to stop here again in the interest of not having my videos be so long. I am going to post another one about Christine Jorgensen soon, and we're going to talk about her transition, which was very, very public. And then we'll talk about a little bit more of what was going on in the late 1950s as we move into the 1960s in transgender history. All right, enjoy. I'll see you soon.